take a picture when we're
You want a picture?
during the panel?
I will take a picture.
You can. You can. Oh, shit. Hello, hello. You can come in front here as well, please. There is. The idea is to have a nice dialogue, so there is some chairs here. So please.
Roland is sitting at the back.
Yeah, exactly. I start to give the. Good morning, everyone. I hope, just checking if there is still more people. Well, we have one panelist that will come just now. So anyway, thank you very much for joining today on this Saturday, so which is a working Saturday for the COP. So people obviously coming over. Voila. There we are. Now the panel is complete. So my name is Luca De Giovanetti. I work at WBCSD, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. I'm senior manager on the built environment, so mainly working on circularity and decarbonization of the built environment. And today's discussion is about net zero building. What do we mean? And question mark, because obviously there is a many definition of interpretation of net zero building and net zero in general. So we just thought to convene a dialogue, and as you see, the layout is a bit different than the previous panel, so because we want to create dialogue with you all, and obviously with the estimated panelists that we have here, to discuss about the net zero and the net zero for net zero building. So just maybe, yeah, so first maybe just quickly an overview of what do we do at WBCSD. We really aim to bring together our members. So we have over 200 of global companies working on sustainability at WBCSD. And in the project on the built environment, we're really looking at create dialogue and platform along the whole system, along the whole value chain of buildings, from material, design, construction, use and operation, and the financial, so institution and developer. So really convene all the groups together. And the vision that we want to drive is really the importance of how do we halve emission as a system, as a built environment. The emission that you can see there, the 40% or close to 40% of global emission are linked directly or indirectly to building. How do we halve that by 2030 and achieve net zero by 2050? And important as well is that at the building level, so at the individual building level, what the vision as well that we have also is in the human settlement report, the high-level champion as well vision is we need, and World GBC of course, so everybody, so we looking at that by 2030, all new buildings should be net zero in operation and at least 40, ideally 50% reduction in embodied carbon by 2030. And then obviously net zero by 2050. So this is kind of, I think, very important vision of where we need to go. So yeah, as I mentioned, the discussion, the idea is to have like discussion with the panel, but please, if you have anything you want to add or say, I invite you to sit on the panel and ask your question or make your statement. So, so it's everybody that contribute can be a fan. Just now. So I want to first give the word to Emmanuel Normand, Vice President for Sustainable Development at Saint-Gobain. And you have been a very, one of our champions as well in the importance of bringing the members and the whole life cycle of buildings and the stakeholder together. Maybe if you want to give some word of why this important work of convening the members, convening business at systemic level is important.
Thank you, Luca. Thanks for this panel. I'm sure that here in the room, it's group of specialists already that is already fully convinced of the important to have a system approach. But just giving you two ideas, which for me are very relevant, what it means actually. I'm a producer of building materials, glass, plasterboard, gypsum, insulation, and so on. That means what? That my scope 1 is the scope 3 of a tenant of real estate. As well as if anybody here in the room is a developer, part of his scope 1 is the scope 3 of somebody else. If you have a tenant, part of his scope 1 is the scope 3 of a real estate developer. So first we see well that all this is very interlinked. Second, I produce glass. I can produce single glazing or I can produce double glazing. Obviously, you don't need to be a high-level mathematician to understand that the impact, the footprint in carbon of double glazing is twice the footprint of single glazing. Obviously, my strategy as Saint-Gobain is not to promote single glazing, but it's to promote double glazing, because the benefit of the usage of double glazing by far overcome what is the difference between single glazing and double glazing. So for that, to be able to have an approach that makes that we are taking at building level the right decisions, what do we need? We need a common language. I need to understand, or our real estate needs to understand, the developer needs to understand what it means for them to set a target and how I relate the targets that I'm, as a real estate, put compared to what is the target of a manufacturer of building materials. We are not talking about the same units. We are not talking, I may talk about tons of CO2 per tons of glass, or by square meter of glass. A real estate developer may think about tons of CO2 by square meter of buildings. So how do we bring all this together under a common language based on life cycle analysis? And then, how do we make sure that this common language is spread all across the value chain, so that the people all across the value chain are able to use that common information to take decisions? That was the whole purpose of this work that we started already a few years ago under the leadership of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, to bring together the value chain all together, to work on a common language, to work in order to understand how to spread that common language all across the value chain, and how to make that each part of the value chain endorsed and apply that common language.
Thank you, Manuel. Very good to set the scene. Now, I would like to move the discussion first to context setting net zero. And I have to admit, I'm very fortunate to have Daniel Barlow, which is the head of innovation policy at BSI, and actually also Ulrika Freike, I hope I did say correct, which is the president of ISO, and she's also chair of the Swedish Green Building Council. So perfect. So it's really good to have actually an expert in ISO on buildings. So we'll help in the next step. So, but yeah, Daniel. So I mean, thank you for joining, and I leave it to you to say why you're here, but. And actually, if you need to show what it is, why the reason is. So yeah, maybe actually, maybe let me say. So you just released yesterday the net zero guidelines for ISO. So what does net zero means practically? So maybe a question to you is, what is the guidelines and what it does, and what it is and what it does?
Absolutely, thank you very much. And I've definitely got imposter syndrome here with the president of ISO and your chairmanship of the Green Building Council in Sweden as well. So I represent BSI, but I also represent our 2050 World, which is a collaboration of ISO, the Race to Zero campaign, and the UNFCCC Global Innovation Hub. And we announced last year at COP26 that this collaboration was forming and that we were going to develop something called the Net Zero Guidelines, which, as you said, Luca, was released yesterday. And what the Net Zero Guidelines do is it builds on the voluntary initiatives, so such as the one that we were talking about there, SBTI, loads of other initiatives, and the brilliant momentum that they've built, and it builds on those and tries to bring up this common language. So what we've got here is a common reference text, a common way of thinking about it that spans all stages of net zero action, but also all actor types. And what that looks to do is to make sure that we're harmonizing and we're aligning. So when we're developing new ways of thinking about net zero, more specific action that needs to be taken, or we're thinking about how we need to move into a more mandated way of taking action, as the UN Secretary General was saying on Tuesday when he announced the high-level expert group report, that it's doing it in a way that fits the science, it fits the ambition of 1.5 degrees, and it's done in a consistent way.
Maybe, yeah, as you say, that it links, so it will provide guidelines for all net zero definitions or net zero standards. And so how does it link with the current initiative, especially, I think, science-based target, where companies are working already for quite some time on the net zero standard. Company, I see here, Holcim, that also, I think, 2 days ago was announced that that the net zero target approved. So what does it mean? What does it mean for the standard like that now? So
Absolutely. So these are guidelines, and they, as I said, these build on existing initiatives like SBTIs, and actually we reference SBTI and draw from their expertise and the momentum that they've built, both in the excellent guidelines and the companies that have chosen to follow them. So the context setting is that SBTI, for example, is an initiative that corporates can follow. They can use to set their targets, and then they can be checked towards. They can be it's a standard. They can meet those requirements. The guidelines are just principles and recommendations. So it sets that context, and hopefully, and this is the conveyor model that was written by Tom Hale that we base some of our thinking on. It allows you to sort of push that further into, say, regulation and develop more guidance that's more specific, more action orientated for the specific actors.
and maybe just then to kick off the discussion on buildings, what does that help, or how this guideline can help on net zero buildings definition and target?
Absolutely. So when we were talking beforehand, you were saying that let me just get it right, that the World Building Council has their net zero building commitments that's been set, but obviously the World Building Council has many different jurisdictions. Now, guidelines and actually international standards respect different jurisdictions, so it can be used as that common reference point to help those specific different types of requirements in different jurisdictions to do it in an aligned and consistent way. But actually, the document does have some references. So I did a Control F in Adobe before I came in here and looked up buildings, and there was 11 specific recommendations that talked about buildings. So it talks about, and I can see it on the wall in front of me here, design better and build with less. So it talks about the need to be retrofitting as much as possible rather than building new buildings. It talks about the use of, or the recommendation that you should use biomass in buildings as often as possible. And I think the point that you made, Emmanuel, I think the other thing that it really helps, and I also mentioned this before, is it's all about that common language. And we're not going to get to net zero as a planet if we don't have that common language. So the net zero guidelines are meant to do that. And actually, one thing I failed to mention is the net zero guidelines are quite unique in the sense of how they were developed. So they were developed over 3 months earlier this year. There was 1,200 people that registered to be part of their development through what is called an international workshop agreement. So it's an ISO deliverable. Anyone could have got involved. You just register, and then you can join by submitting comments. And we received over 4,000 comments on different iterations of this document. And you can also join the workshops. So we had 36 hours of workshops, 12 3-hour sessions, which was very, very taxing. But that's how we reached this consensus. So it's quite unique in the sense that anyone can get involved, and it's really sort of the mandate of ISO to bring the world together. And there isn't a challenge that's bigger than reaching net zero in my mind that needs to be met with that sort of approach.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good start for then segue to the other people. So maybe I quickly introduce the other panelists, but I mean panelists just because it's the terminology we use here, but contributor to the discussion I would call, because I would like obviously everybody of you to join as well. Nigel Tongs, which is director at Arup, and is also actually part of the high-level champion team on building. So supporting, we had strong engagement on the Building to COP coalition, which brought together various organizations in leveraging the collaboration to the raising the awareness and the importance of buildings and the built environment in the COP. Victoria Barrow, so she's the director of Advancing Net Zero, and then obviously some question related to what Daniel just mentioned. And Sunita Purushottam, I hope I practiced, but hopefully did it right. So she is head of sustainability at Mahindra Life Spaces in India. So I start with Victoria, mainly because she would have to, unfortunately, to leave at 1. So so let's mix. I mean, I just want maybe a quick reaction, like of what you heard now. What is the, like the importance of the common language, and so we obviously work a lot together on the whole life carbon. So we have a strong collaboration on that. And then so like what does it mean on that? So the
Okay, well, hi everyone, again, most of you. First of all, congratulations on achieving consensus. Something that we struggle with quite a lot at World Green Building Council. Within even our Europe regional network, lots of discussions. Actually, we launched something yesterday for our Africa regional network, and our Africa programs head even said in the launch that this consultation involved lots of arguments, lots of debates. Like, these things take a lot of time, and sometimes we have to compromise, right? So the World Green Building Council's Advancing Net Zero program has the whole life carbon vision, which has evolved from a definition that previously focused on operational carbon only. And of course, we all know that we need to be addressing the emissions from embodied carbon as well. And it is also born from having that challenge of needing a definition or an approach that can be applied in any market around the world, including in a country where you might have a grid that's by virtue of its location low carbon, but the buildings might not be energy efficient, and therefore does that count as net zero? So the inclusion of whole life carbon into our net zero carbon buildings commitment says that the dates of 2050 that we all know and that are now embedded in that climate action plan for the Marrakesh partnerships, in order for us to achieve that target as a sector and globally, we need to be taking accelerated action by 2030 to understand what that means. Like, what new business approaches do we need? What new business models do we need? What changes to the supply chain do we need? What tools and methodologies do we need? What guidelines now, And when we sort of enhance the commitment requirements to include whole life carbon, our thinking there was that we can set a 40% definition, 40% reduction within the vision, which we managed to achieve consensus of. But do you remember there was hours of debate over 10%. So even that was okay. Yeah, let's not think about that. That was tough. But we can't use 40% as the target and then pat ourselves on the back. Like, to us, that's not okay. Like, we need to be still reaching for those higher levels of performance. And so, although at a world GBC global level, we can't say, here's what good looks like from energy efficiency point of view, because even the methodology for calculating an EUI varies country to country. Sometimes it includes gross, and sometimes it's net, and sometimes it includes on-site energy generation, and sometimes it doesn't. So for us to set a percentage or an average EUI is actually very difficult. And so we rely on the local GBCs to determine what good looks like in those different markets. You mentioned the different jurisdictions. That's exactly what they're there for. And so the various net zero programs from the GBCs set out what that good looks like. And then what we did with the I think we called it Advancing Net Zero Whole Life Carbon paper, our offsets paper last year, was to say we have to do something about that 60%. In many markets, you can't achieve a 90% reduction and then offset with carbon removals if you're going to follow the kind of purest definition of net zero. So we call it Advancing Net Zero, like every step is helping us get closer. but that we also can't rely on a kind of high target that may not be achievable in some markets, that then carbon removals, which may not be applicable or too nascent in some markets. So we need to give an achievable and tangible and pragmatic approach in some of those different countries. And so that's what the whole life carbon part of the commitment says. It says, don't just get to 40% and say, good job, do something about what's left. And if on the transition to achieving that sort of golden moment of having a net zero based on a 90% reduction and carbon removals, there's other options for our market to do something, or it's for our sector to do something about the impacts we're causing by just building or just operating our buildings now. We can't wait for that perfect scenario where we've got everything figured out and use that as a reason not to take action. So that's why we call it advancing net zero. That's why there's all these different milestones and part of the transition, but the message to our green building councils has been incremental change is not happening fast enough, it's not good enough. We need to do more than building buildings that are a bit more green or a bit less bad. We have to be, striving for those goals, and you'll find that some of the GBCs have incorporated some of that within their rating tools now. Particularly the Green Building Council for Australia, and I've just heard from the US GBC that it might be coming to lead, and I think that's as much as I can say. But it's happening, right? We set the vision, we let them work out what the definition is right for the market, and these guidelines will really help with more GBCs being able to do that in a credible way, and then we'll see that come through within their programs.
Actually, a follow-up question on that. I mean, as you mentioned that different geography or different countries, they have a slightly different interpretation of what net zero means. And obviously, the feedback many times you get, especially from companies that operate in multiple geography, is every time it means that they have to check, here, this is in, this is out, this is the different, this is a different interpretation. A question is it good for the country to have a slightly specific differentiation, or can it be done to come to a more global approach that kind of align all countries on net zero, on the same definition for what net zero building means, so that it's easy as well then for the implementation of that?
So the approach we take for the frameworks and principles at World GBC is to say, here's the baseline, here's the bare minimum you should be working to, and then refine that and adapt it to be what's appropriate in your market. So you'll find the definitions that the GBCs are using in Europe are far more advanced than our standard baseline definition. For us, the challenge is kind of defining that scope, but also defining the thing that we get asked much more than scope is, what do we mean by maximum reduction? And that's a number we can't pin down, because the percentage improvement will depend on the baseline. And in some countries, there is no baseline, right? There's no, you can just do whatever. And what we want to avoid is a scenario, I'm sure everyone's full of integrity in this room, but let's just say, for argument's sake, that your 40% reduction is based on a comparison with a building that had a basement that was never going to have a basement in the first place, right? So the danger with putting a figure on it is that it's easily manipulated, and that's what we've tried to avoid by saying, focus on what's relevant for the local market. And I know that's difficult for multinational organizations, but for us, we find that means you get, ultimately the building is in a country, it's not in a multi-country zone, right? It's in one country, and it needs to be designed to be appropriate for that country. And that's why we say, instead of working up from the baseline, work back from net zero.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. And actually, you probably need to go? No, thanks a lot. Thanks for joining. Yeah, of course, then we can catch up after. Anyway, we will. So thanks a lot. And yeah, actually, but this is actually a good question, then follow up, and I would like to bring in Nigel for this, because we speak about the 40% reduction, and the work we did with Arup on net zero building, where do we stand? We say, well, instead of speaking about a reduction target, can we set a quantitative target and say, this is the number that we should reach? And based on the work we did there back last year, we suggested that maybe we should aim, like, for example, at 400 kilograms of CO2 per square meter as embodied carbon as a fixed target. So instead then, and then obviously different geography, they might have different, is high or low, But if we start to speak with a fixed number, then we avoid this discussion. Well, 40% reduction based on what? So we avoid a discussion about that. So, but then maybe Nigel, I wanted to also ask with you. I mean, Arup just mentioned yesterday, but the other day before actually, from your chairman that you have conducted the assessment of like 1,000 buildings, they're all live carbon, and you have shown that you would like showing the result and so microphone. So maybe if you can tell more about that and what that exercise gave you as a lesson for what a net zero building means. What net zero, or how far are we from reaching that? So.
I'll try and answer that question. I was thinking after the presentations that we just heard of a very, very recent anecdote. Only yesterday I was on a panel, and I'd been invited to the panel to share some of the information and some of the insights that we've gathered this year from the platform that we created to assess all of our buildings projects. And the results of that show a huge variation of whole life carbon across all the different countries. So we have over 1,000 projects across 30 countries. And for specific building typologies, there is a vast range of whole life carbon, which includes the embodied carbon, the operational carbon, over a whole life period of 60 years. And it includes the whole building. So it would include structures, services, facades, and so on. So very, very wide range from 600, 700 kilograms per square meter up to over 1,000. And I was on this panel, and I was sharing the panel with an eminent academician from a really eminent European university, and that person was asked, they were sharing their results, and they'd done a lot of very, very careful, rigorous work, and they were advising on national policy, and that their work showed that their carbon targets were they were achieving 10 kilograms per square meter. So I was in a panel at an event like this with somebody who'd done a lot of rigorous, careful research talking about 10 kilograms per square meter, and I knew that I was talking between 600 and 1,000 kilograms per square meter. And the moderator asked me, well, how do your numbers compare? Which was a really difficult question. And it was only afterwards that I was able to ascertain that the numbers that the professor was giving were they were whole life, whole building, but they were per year. Okay, so then you've got to multiply that by 60 years, let's say, or some factor of that to be able to. So it's so critical to have this common framework, this common language, and it's really critical for our clients. We engaged with their offices around the world. We had over 1,100 experts from 30 offices contributing to help us design the data gathering platform, and then to input their data. And so from the United States, from China, Australia, Europe, Africa, and the UK. And whilst there are experts in those countries, they're all coming from a slightly different place. They're all coming from different language, different set of metrics, or even a different sort of maturity of how valuable or important whole life carbon is. Some people were coming from a point of just awareness, not really knowledge or understanding, but just awareness. They'd heard about it, they understood the importance of it, but they didn't really have any purchase on what whole life carbon meant, right the way through to people who've been pioneering embodied carbon analysis for 15 years. So that language was a real insight to me. Our professions have come at this from a different level of readiness. So it was very noticeable to me that the structural profession was quite advanced in this area because, you know, material efficiency is very important. Two of the most carbon consumptive materials are in the hard to abate areas of industry, steel and concrete. So, you know, our structural colleagues in the world have been on this for a little while. But our building services colleagues have been engaged since the oil crisis in operational energy efficiency, and they don't really have a mature understanding of embodied carbon. So the value of this gives us a common language. The value of doing the analysis, actually coming up with a common, we've come up with a common framework of analysis so that we've got comparable data internationally for the whole building, whole life carbon. It is a phenomenal learning tool. You know, everybody that engages with it now starts to say, oh, but hang on, you know. So for instance, a really big challenge that's come back from our membership is, how do I build in the grid decarbonisation in my country over the next 60 years when we don't have grid decarbonisation policy or pathway? You know, so those things are really challenging. Material embodied carbon from country to country. How do you get access to really good current data for all of the materials that go into buildings on a country by country basis? Somebody wanted to come in on that point. So you know, I promise not to hog the floor for too much, but if I think about what we want to do, which is to drive carbon out of the early decision making on projects in an affordable way, developers, investors, they want insurable investment assets. They want to know that when we make recommendations at an early design phase, that will have a consequential reduction which can materialize through the design and not get value engineered out when the contractor gets hold of it and says, well, you know, the cost of this is way outside the client's budget, so we're going to drop the innovation and go to a conventional methodology. Or I really love this concrete substitute, cement substitute that you've specified, but there's just simply not enough supply for us to be able to afford to access this. We're not going to do it on this project. So our clients need to be able to trust what consultants are telling them. And, you know, without these definitions at the moment, consultants are saying, well, net zero is this, and this is so many kilograms per square meter of your building. They might only be referring to the structure. They're not referring to a net zero building, the whole building. Or they might only be referring to the upfront carbon, not the whole life. So we've got to get that language out there.
Hello. Hi. My name is Mustafa Saad. I'm with the Canadian delegation representing Concordia University. I'm a researcher in building decarbonization, city building energy models. So my question actually drives from the point of, we're talking about net zero energy buildings, and it comes to the question, like, from my practice in that field, we lack carbon information about materials. Like, it varies all over the world. We lack information about buildings, and we lack some information about, like, possible tools for standardization and for common simulation, and we even lack some standards for common comparative analysis between different, like, for example, the 60 years lifetime. Some studies do it like 50 years, and it varies. So are we late to the game as building professionals? Like, that's just like a question for all the panel. Are we late to the game and we're like losing on it? And are we only considering new construction in what we are discussing? And what about existing buildings? Is like, I model existing buildings. That's my focus of research. I get to archetype buildings depending on the geolocation of it and the urban structure of the location. And there is variation when you're modeling an existing building because you're never having the rigorous data of a new building construction with a BIM full detailed model. So this is like a whole set of questions or like a point of discussion that I wanted to bring up. Thank you so much for the time.
I just want to react by just saying, as you mentioned, you know, the whole life carbon needs standardization. I'm sitting here between two standardization experts. So my question could be, how long would it take to maybe have a ISO all life carbon standard?
Well, I think that we do have a lot of standards already, especially on energy efficiency for buildings and so on. So it's really all there. But the problem is, I think, with the standards, to be honest, is it's a bit of silos. So it doesn't go all over the page, really. And that is why the net zero paper is so important. The guidelines are so important because they go in a totally different direction all over. But there are standards out there for merely everything. But I think the thing that I'm from this, you know, this business as well, and I think the thing that we do miss is the business models. You're talking about contractors. Where do they make their money? Yes, on the contract, but also on everything that goes into that building. They have percentages of all the materials that go into the building. So why would they promote something that is more expensive than something that is very cheap and make them more money? I mean, that's nothing. So I think this is a question that has to start in the boardrooms. And all the managing directors and CEOs out there, CTOs out there, have to be measured in their performances on what they do on net zero. That is where it starts. And then it can trickle down to in the organizations. But there are definitely standards there to be used. Most of them are already in place. And I know it works quite well if you work over time. I work with a company in Sweden that we have worked with this for several years. We have won the GRESB prize twice now for being best in the world, because we've been doing it for such a long time. But nobody would have known that we would have reached that position for the first year. But it's constantly having to work, you know, every year reducing. So long term. And another aspect on the business is that some companies see buildings as a merchandise. They develop a building to sell. And if you don't take the long-term view on buildings that will actually stand for more than 60 years, some of them standing 100 years. My apartment was built in 1906. So, I mean, some of them are very old. So that is what we have to consider when we talk about buildings. It's a long journey and a long time where the building is standing.
Yeah, absolutely. And the common approach or a common way of looking, that will be very useful. And but that's nice because it triggered input and discussion. So Magali?
Sorry, what you said, Ulrika, was so interesting that I thought I had to bring the cement view or the Holcim view. I'm in charge of sustainability and innovation for Holcim. And to answer your question, there's a simple tool that exists today, which is called EPD, Environmental Product Declaration. And I think that the globalization of EPDs is so important. It's something we all want. Building material people, we want it because we want to be judged on our true whole life cycle footprint and not just on myths of a lot of things. You know, should I put a single glaze instead of a double glaze? Why should I put a double glaze when single glaze is so much less CO2 type of things? But the reason why I really wanted to talk was about what you said about changing the business model. That's something I am absolutely passionate about because I think that's so true, so much quicker way to achieve what we need than any other methodology. So us cement makers, or building material makers I should say, we are all working on how to reduce the CO2 per ton of cement tissue, CO2 per cubic meter of concrete. We do a fantastic job there. We have pledges, we have SBTI, we have all of that. But I continue to be incentivized to sell as much cement as possible. The more cement I sell, the better I am paid. So that's not my interest to sell less cement. So how do I flip that? How do I flip the barrel to make it in such a way that I'm being incentivized to sell less cement? How do I truly build more with less? And I think that full avenue of value chain collaboration on how we can start system thinking, where I would sell you a flooring system, but the floor itself I'm selling you, not the cement that goes in the flooring. And then I can start working with universities, as we are doing with ETH right now, to develop a flooring system with much less cement. But I am not encouraged to do it if I only sell the cement. I'm encouraged to do it if I sell the flooring system. So I think that business model discussion, if we truly want to accelerate, absolutely needs to happen. And I find that we don't talk about it enough. That's why I jumped, because I really love when you said that. Sorry for disturbing him.
Thank you, Magali. You wanted to react? Then I want to go to Sunita, sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on something that you were talking about, and I really loved what you said about sort of are we linked to the game, and I think that's sort of what I've seen through the development of the Net Zero guidelines is there isn't really a game that you need to be linked to. There is just so many different games that people are playing, and I think as you were saying, it's the solutions. It's sort of like taking it up a step higher and working out what the purpose that we want to achieve is. Obviously, you need to survive. You need to make the money. Obviously, the game is to make as much money as possible to a certain extent if you're a for profit. But if we can use the Net Zero guidelines or anything really, it doesn't need to be the document that I'm talking about, to try and bring those links together that respects jurisdictions, that respects every individual game that every type of organisation is playing that's slightly different. That's how you get there. And Annika, who's in the crowd, said to me the day before yesterday when we were having dinner that it's taps that's climate change, and it's floors that's climate change, and it's chairs, and it's everything. And I mean, the ISO system has a catalogue of 24,000 standards, 26,000. In the UK, we have 96,000 standards in our British catalogue, and all of those need to change, and all of those need to fit together. And then outside of the ISO system and outside of the UK's national standards body system, there's far more that aren't included, and that's what the change of the game looks like, and that's where we need this sort of radical collaboration, and we need to work out how we fit the whole game together.
96,000 to change.
Exactly.
Some work to be done.
and all having those arguments that you get with consensus building.
Yeah. I just want to get to you, Sunita, because we spoke about net zero standard, net zero definition, all life carbon, and I think this discussion it's in the legislation as well at European level. In the US is starting as well, but obviously to solve the climate challenge, we need to make it global. We need to address that at global level, especially. And now I don't know if in all these statistics there is these numbers as well, but in the emerging economies, that's where the biggest growth of buildings is going to take place in the next years. So how it is the situation in India, if you can give us some insight on that, on net zero building and the whole life carbon, and integrating as well the full life cycle.
So thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. So basically, the number of buildings that we need by 2030 is yet to be built. So that presents us a huge opportunity to develop buildings which are net zero, provided we have a common language. But I would say we need to have a simple language, because it is difficult for people to understand what carbon means or what energy net zero means, or it's easier to understand zero waste to landfill, but for carbon it needs to be broken down. So in India there are a few developers like us who have taken carbon targets and carbon goals. We are the only ones in India to have signed up for science-based targets approved, which was approved in 2019. We also have given, we have undertaken a net zero buildings by 2030 target, which means net zero energy, waste, and water. We still have to, figure out how we will look at the net zero carbon piece, which is on a longer time horizon. But carbon holistically has to be addressed. What we would want, what we have seen in India is standards come in. I would say rating systems that help us quantify and get rated for design for net zero energy, waste and water, it has been broken down for simplicity and adoption. So there is the Indian Green Building Council and there is GRIHA. Both of them have rating systems for net zero, and net zero carbon rating is going to be developed. So the uptake, there is an uptake for that, and I see a huge uptake in the commercial segment, ITC hotels, and there are other developers who have jumped onto it. We have developed India's first net zero energy building in Bangalore. So that's the kind of movement that we are seeing in emerging market. And it's a need, because simplifying the language, while the common language is required, it is important to simplify it, because there are two stakeholders that I'm dealing with. One is the customers who I have sold a net zero energy rated building. What does it mean? What do they need to do? How does it translate into daily actions? I will have to break it down. I can't say your CO2 emissions are going to be this, and by doing this, people don't care about CO2 emissions. Normal person on the road, they don't understand. So, and I'll give you examples of what I mean by that. So they can't even link the energy consumption to their carbon emissions or the purchases that they make on a daily basis. There are endless arguments that we have in friend circles that people feel that, I am stopping them from purchasing. But yes, conscious purchasing, where you buy things from, and that applies to corporates as it applies to individuals. So simplifying the language is very important. 2 years back, we had launched a project where we had said we will reduce the cost of maintenance. How is cost of maintenance reduced? If you reduce the water consumption, energy consumption, it will reduce the cost of maintenance. And that immediately was taken by the end customer. So while we talk about the carbon language, we also need to transfer the language into what people understand and can make it actionable. Customers are the key, because we want the whole population of India to understand what it means when you are purchasing a home. So that's one. The other is the internal stakeholders. How do I get the contractors? The contracting community is, they need to understand that they can't waste, and it is linked to carbon. How do you get that? And there are zillions of examples as we visit sites to see how they don't link it to, let alone carbon or to the losses, So making people understand that this leads to business losses, and through the whole systems thinking, that will help. And the other point I want to make is, from land acquisition to the end use, there is a carbon language to it. So whatever decisions I'm making will incur some costs at various stages, and we will have to understand what is the whole system carbon. So while you referred to the embodied carbon and the material choices, how does it have an impact on the use phase? That I will need to see. What is the use operational carbon piece? How do you get the design impacts in? For example, I want the shading and the ventilation in. I want to use the high performance glass. I want to ensure the wall to window ratio has, all of these have an impact on the carbon of the building and the materials. So when you deal with the internal stakeholders, they may come up with value engineering. They get value engineered out. And it could happen without your knowledge. And, things may get just taken off from a building design. How do you stop that? Because you thought you have done a climate responsive design and you've given the different materials, but it got value engineered out. So what are the incentives that we need to build inside? What language will communicate to the business stakeholders? And most interestingly, these are contradictory KPIs or KRAs. So the facility manager may have an energy efficiency target, which gets value engineered out by a person who is sitting at the cost front. How do you manage the whole thing and get the business on the same page that this needs to be done? And perhaps even EPI is not the right indicator for carbon, because I really need, there could be, you could be adding energy systems and making it energy efficient, but actually I need climate responsive design. So it's complicated, but it has to be simplified.
Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, And as you say, the problem is big, and the value chain is so fragmented that each one has they play a role, and that's why the collaboration. So if you have questions, you can come. And I have a question to Emmanuel, maybe. You know, like, I mean, of all this discussion now that you see, so what point does it trigger in your work on science-based target, but on net zero in general? How you see the situation going based on?
I don't want to disparate everybody. I want to give confidence back. So remembering to everybody that 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions are related to buildings. It's written. 2/3 of this through operational carbon, 1/3 through embodied carbon. With already existing solutions, we can decarbonize by 2/3 this carbon. Good news is that, I mean, Saint-Gobain is having a lot of those solutions to do more energy efficiency, obviously. I can help you sell less carbon, less cement if you want, by lightweight solutions, or helping to decarbonize concrete. There's a lot of solution. And I think that in all these discussions, we need to understand that there's a lot of existing solution. Also, a lot of our materials can be decarbonized. I mean, at Saint-Gobain, we have our own commitments, and we have already produced glass that is zero carbon in scope 1 and 2. We will have our first plasterboard plant next year in Norway, which will be zero carbon in scope 1 and 2. So it's possible. It's possible to reduce today and very quickly the carbon content on all this. And I would say all the tools that we are developing needs to help all the ecosystem to accelerate, starting by obviously all the labels that are being developed, but a very significant role of regulation to make it happen.
I'll keep on the theme of positivity. I think that the glass is really half full. I'm Andrew Minson. I represent the Global Cement and Concrete Association. Some of our members are in the room. Just really quickly, just plug a roadmap that we launched a year ago, global to 2050 net zero, so it can be done. And we're now doing for last year, and we're continuing implementing that at national level. That's not what I want. I want to continue the positivity. So that's great. We can do this, but I think the conversation is about how we get there, isn't it? How we get the common language and how we deliver it and how we help people down the value chain to do it. So at product level and then at building level. At product level, we've had EPDs trailed. So one of the, and it's a detail, EPDs, the glass is really half full, more than half full, really full. But a little plea would be when you get involved with EPDs, let's try and keep the common language across countries. So the pursuit of perfection can be the enemy of the good. So we're seeing a little bit of pursuit of perfection, where when EPDs come into India or other countries, they want to do, well, actually in India we want to do it slightly different because we've got this particular aspect. Now, we need to challenge when that particular aspect is important and should be important, and when it's actually a nice to have and not important, and therefore can slow the process down. And then when it comes to Nigel's comparison of buildings, he discovers that the EPD is different in India than it is in Thailand, and actually probably for no good reason. So we need to just be careful of that. At the building level, the bit I'm interested in is the functional equivalence. So, I mean, 1,000 buildings is unbelievable what you've done, and we want to get to a point where we can, I mean, we're almost at the point where we can compare products, but comparing buildings is really difficult. And somehow we have to put in enough aspects, parameters on functional equivalence. Is it single glazed or is it double glazed? Different performance happens. We don't want to put so many parameters that actually all your 1,000 buildings are all unique and therefore there's no comparison possible. How do we wrestle with that challenge of a common language of what is functional equivalence?
I have a very quick question for the two of you. Among the 96,000 standards that you are working on, do you think we can land on one universal global standard which defines you want to build an infrastructure, a building that is aligned to 1.5 degree? This is how you do it, this is how you define it. to shift the market so that we can use and use now all these solutions that are available?
You want to start, or should I work?
I think yes.
I think it is a possibility, but what I mentioned before is the standards have to be a tendency to go in silos. So that is the purpose with this product, is everybody work toward with this simplified net zero guidelines. We will get very far. And the purpose of standards is, of course, that it should be ISO standards, is that it should be used worldwide. And if you differ from that standard, you should say that. You should state that. And let me just make one more remark on this. There is a lot of things out there where we can use today. And there are companies using the things that we have. But we will be helped with the sustainability reports that every company now will have to create. And there has to be numbers in those reports that has to be, certified in a certain way. So within the EU, there are no standards coming along. ISSB is the new auditors group that will come along, and they will also have figures. And that means that all the tenants will need to have figures for the real estate companies to put in their reports. So it doesn't only become a real estate problem anymore, it becomes a very huge problem for a lot of stakeholders that are tenants in these buildings that would need to know what kind of recipe the cement had that went into that building. They will want a figure, not from year one, because it will evolve over time, but it will push. And if I come from the corporate world, and we know we do as the auditors say, because it's so much simpler than taking the discussion. So they will help us push this development, I'm sure of it. And they will need standards in doing so.
Very, very.
Hi, I'm Katalin Ketani from the Blockchain and Climate Institute, but my background is architecture. The most important function or objective of the net zero building is to be able to measure and validate the CO2 emission of the building. And we heard about this, that the transparency and accountability is very important. We also heard about the need for a new business model. And we also know that the construction industry is an incredibly complex space with numerous stakeholders. So is there any consideration or interest in this context to explore the adaptability or the usability of blockchain technologies for CO2 emission measuring or validation?
I don't know if there is 10-second reaction to that. Otherwise, I think data is obviously crucial. I mean, I would just say data is crucial, and actually that's also what we want to do next. Obviously, how you make sure that, the amount of data that we have, how do you address that? So, but yeah, data is definitely important, I would say. It's crucial, not only in the buildings, everywhere. So at WBCSD, we have the...
So I have a reaction. So I think the supply chain would be the right area where this kind of technology can be used. But historically, this sector is, it's been difficult for digitization because of the fragmented nature of the, the contractors and the material manufacturers. So bringing in that kind of technology will lead to traceability, which will help us understand, where it's coming from, what is the data associated with that, and that's very important. But this requires huge amount of funding and somebody to take it up as a project for the sector in various geographies. So that blockchain technology itself, to make it viable, will take time. So it requires huge amount of funding, and because it is very difficult to digitize the sector also, there's a huge resistance, because it's very unorganized in India. It's pretty unorganized. So how do you get them to even adapt or adopt to what technology requirements are? It's very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, time is against us. I mean, as we were speaking this morning with Roland, I'm sure that this hour will fly, and we could probably have it for 2 hours. I just want from each panelist, 10-second reaction of what do you think we should do next now on net zero in built environment. 10 seconds, just, and what would you do? So maybe starting from...
mean, continue to make that this common language is being endorsed by all stakeholders?
Common language to be endorsed by all stakeholders, simplified. So I'll help in the simplification.
I'd like everyone in the supply chain to assess whole life carbon of their products and their advice to build up that database. And then I would like us, rather than build data pools, to work towards a common standard for carbon data, a common standard framework, because within 2 or 3 years, there are going to be millions of data source points. And data pools right now are not going to be designed in a way to handle that kind of input. So 5 years from now, EPDs will be out of date. We need the updated EPDs. Grid decarbonisation will be emerging from lots of countries. So you want to get access to data, live data, reliable data straight away, which kind of plays to your point. And that requires not just a language, but a common data exchange framework.
And everything that was said before, but very practically, go to iso.org/net zero and use the net zero guidelines to do that commonality. That one there, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, actually, also the inputs, I'm glad, because actually that's what we've been doing and we're currently doing again. I just want to say, indeed, as Emmanuel said, solution exists. We can do it now. We can already do now. And actually what we would like to say is that we need to build today the building that we need for 2030. So we can do it now. So we don't have to wait for 2030 to build net zero building in operation and halving embodied carbon. Solution exists. We're finalizing in these weeks a publication again with Arab on how low can we go on embodied carbon, demonstrating that we can reduce that. So watch out for that. And thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you very much to all of you to join, and have a good rest of the day and rest of the COP. Thank you very much.
Very good.
Yeah, so
Can I have a squint at your...